The book will be illustrated. The cover of the book is going to be by the wonderful Storn Cook, who was absolutely my first choice to actually work on this. Hopefully, there should be pops ups. The art that you're seeing now from this is some of the character art that Storn has already completed for this. We hope to get a great deal more of it from him if the Kickstarter is successful. The Golden Age Champions book. There are two ways to play a Golden Age superheroes campaign. One is to actually attempt to duplicate the comic books actually of the period at the time for them. Unfortunately, that tends to make for bad role-playing. It's a less effective game. While we are certainly drawing on those characters and those adventures and those stories for material and for inspiration and for style, actually playing in the period mode is not the most effective way to actually play at the table for it. First of all, most Golden Age superhero team comics did not involve characters working together very much, which means you have a lot of isolation of the players. A typical Golden Age superhero team comic would begin with a framing story that introduced a problem and a bad guy that was out there, and the team would then immediately split up, and all of the individual heroes would go off and deal with 6 to 8 pages of some sort of crisis on their own. And during the course of that would eventually wind up with a clue that brought them back to where the main bad guy was at the end, who would then be defeated by the heroes in the last 2 pages of the framing story. And frequently those interior pieces would be done by the artist of that character's main comic, if it was as most were, if it was sort of a pantheon of heroes who were published in their own titles. That doesn't work very well for gaming. So instead we tend to follow what's called the retro mode, which is a superhero style, a more modern style of superhero storytelling that is set in that period and is inspired by that period. And so our models for that tend to be like the comics of Roy Thomas in the 70s and 80s, either The Invaders for Marvel or All-Star Squadron and Young All-Stars for DC. Also the various Justice Society comic books, James Robinson's Golden Age, and his Starman also went back into that period as well. So comics that are clearly set in those periods using those characters, but redone in a more modern storytelling style that is in fact easier to actually play at the table. The other advantage, of course, of playing in the retro style is that many of those original period comic books have some fairly unfortunate attitudes about matters like sexism and racism and that sort of thing that we can address, more directly and, match a more modern sensibility about how precisely to handle those situations. We can actually, introduce characters who are of other ethnicities. We can have female characters with some agency within the game, which is fairly difficult to find, barring Wonder Woman. So we are able to kind of address many of those issues from a modern standpoint and avoid a lot of the unpleasantness that you have to sort of grit your teeth just to get through when reading some of the original period fiction. The book discusses some ways of actually role-playing at the table that are relatively new concepts or interesting ideas in managing an actual long-term campaign. One of them is that most of the players, and certainly usually the GMs who have come to a Golden Age game, to a World War II game, are here because they like the period. They're interested in the historical details, in the in the actual story, basically, of World War II and the time leading up to it and the time immediately afterwards. And when you are playing in a historical period like that, especially with characters who are as powerful as some of the superheroes can be for it, it is extremely dangerous. It's extremely likely that players given that kind of agency are not going to want to follow the path that World War II actually takes. There's, kind of the argument of, why didn't the day after Pearl Harbor, Superman and Captain Marvel and the Spectre and Green Lantern just go smash Tokyo flat on December 8th, and while they were at it, go after Berlin on December 9th. So one of the kind of artificial restrictions that we put on the players in my standard way of running a World War II campaign is designed to make sure that the war remains more or less World War II shaped, while still giving players a reasonable amount of agency and the ability to have some effect over what's actually happening in the game. One of the ways that we do that is to borrow a plot element, a plot device from Roy Thomas, in which the Axis powers, some of the super sorcerers of the Axis powers, have cast a spell over the Axis territories, which means that any superheroes, any superhumans who are not allied with the Axis, who are not part of the Axis powers, when they enter Axis territory, they lose their superpowers and are therefore obviously put in tremendous danger. This doesn't apply to the Axis powers, of course. Those characters continue to retain their powers. That makes actually entering Axis territory tremendously dangerous and the sort of activity that should be reserved to the best of the mystery men, right? The least powerful of the heroes, who are basically skill-based, your Batman, your Captain America, Wildcat, Dr. Midnight type characters, who can operate behind enemy lines and go on exciting commando missions, but don't really have the capability to make whole-scale changes in the course of the war themselves. Because they have to operate quietly and behind enemy lines and try not to draw the attention of their more powerful enemies. For this, they're kind of forced to be sneaky, and there is an element of danger put into their adventures that might not otherwise exist. Meanwhile, at home, the powerful characters, the characters with actual superpowers, are put to the test by actually defending the home front from various Nazi invaders. Since the field doesn't work the opposite direction, Axis superhumans can work in America or in Allied territory without facing that restriction. So in order to kind of enforce that as a level of play, basically somewhere around Pearl Harbor, if your campaign gets to that point, I have always called upon my players to actually create a second character. If they're playing a mystery man, they add a superpowered character and vice versa, so that one actual playing group is basically maintaining two entirely different teams of costumed adventurers, one that is operating behind enemy lines in Europe or in Asia, while the other team of superpowered members is back at home protecting the home front, and also incidentally possibly having other adventures in the Champions universe, because certainly the other menaces of the Champions universe are not necessarily taking the war off, and so there might be an occasional story inserted in there in which some other force within the Champions universe might be up to no good and not paying any attention to whether or not we have a war on. I do want to make sure that I mention everybody involved in this. As I said, we're getting fabulous support from Jason Walters, from Bill Keyes, from John Adamus. Jess Nevins has become involved with this as well. He is a wonderful writer, if you're not familiar with him, who wrote the Encyclopedia of Golden Age Superheroes. And there is a support level, listed below on this page for it, where you can see that one of the opportunities that you have in supporting this game is to get a new copy of the Golden Age, the encyclopedia, which had the rights to which have reverted to Jess, and he is putting out a new edition with this, so that you can get both books either in PDF or actual hard copies for these. So not only can you get a game book for gaming in this period, but you also have access to an enormous book full of just the most wonderful public domain superhero characters to use as inspiration in your game. Jess's work is, as always, scholarly and brilliant, and the book has been a tremendous value to me over the course of time that I've been working on this book. Well, the basic structure, that's the stretch goals are listed below on this page for it. Most notably, they involve actually improving the book themselves. for it. At the 20,000 base, it will be a soft cover, black and white book with a color cover, obviously, for it, but the interior will be black and white. And then at levels going up beyond that, at 30,000, I believe it becomes interior color and hard. I'm not sure, actually. Jason, we'll have to check this out here. What the actual levels are for this, but there are the levels, the quality of the book as far as becoming color interior, as far as becoming hardcover, etc. Those levels are laid out below. Oh, I didn't really mention Aaron in this. In some ways, this book is the Golden Age is kind of my first opportunity to really discuss my methods and my manifesto, basically, as far as how to run a historical campaign, how to run a long-term campaign that is tied to a series of historical events and that has sort of a set calendar, kind of like moving the players through, and kind of pacing the campaign. Some of that has been inspired by Aaron Alston, who was an enormous influence on me, particularly Strike Force, the most recent version of which was also put out by High Rock Press. And in that, it's sort of a discussion, that Aaron tried to have, basically of his, best practices at the table, and this is sort of, to a certain extent, it's my answer to that and my sort of thank you to Aaron for all of the efforts. There are a number of other books that are tremendously influential on this, a number of other campaigns. As I mentioned, Steve Long's Pulp Hero, Greg Stafford's Pendragon, which is another game that is very specifically sort of tied to a calendar, and that has a mechanic that sort of propels the players in the campaign forward, and ties it to historical or pseudo-historical events. And that was also an enormous influence on me as I was putting these together. So in the end, I guess, thank you very much for listening to this. I hope that you will find this project as exciting as we all do. And I greatly appreciate your support. Keep them flying. And thanks for paying attention. And thanks for supporting Golden Age Champions by High Rock Press.